On Saturday, the United States of America carried out what is arguably its most daring military operation since the Cold War. A specialized unit of the United States military entered Venezuela and captured that country's president, together with his wife. His name is Nicolas Maduro. He is now a prisoner of the United States, facing charges related to drug trafficking. But the question is, how did we get here? What gives America the power to enter a sovereign country and capture that country's president? And why is that captured president facing drug-related charges? Was Venezuela being led by a drug dealer? What about the international community? What is it saying about this development? And most importantly, Venezuela itself. Is it going to recover from this? Well, fellow Sagittarius, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, snamalites, varkujgarais, never snamarites. Welcome to the special report. Now, in my intro, I said that the capture of the president of Venezuela is arguably the most daring military operation done by America since the Cold War. Now, I say this with full awareness that the United States has carried out extreme military actions in the past. For example, the US invaded Iraq in 2003. It captured Saddam Hussein, and months later, tried and executed him. In Pakistan, the US carried out a covert operation to kill Osama bin Laden without informing the Pakistani government. In Libya, the US was also involved in the removal of Muammar Gaddafi, though the operation also involved NATO. I could go on and on and on, but you get the point. America has done some crazy things in the past, but for me, the capture of the president of Venezuela is a whole new level of flexing by the US, at least since the Cold War. But anyway, who really is this Nicolas Maduro, and what did he do to upset America, to upset Donald Trump, to the point of getting captured, Osama bin Laden style? Well, the story of Nicolas Maduro cannot be understood only through his personal life or political career. It must also be understood from a geopolitical standpoint. Remember, geopolitics is about who controls important things, where are those important things, and why are they important. That's geopolitics paraphrased. So why am I talking about this? Well, you see, Venezuela is a country in South America. It is located in the northern part of that continent. It shares borders with Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana. Other notable countries in South America include Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Bolivia. Now, I know this may seem unrelated to the video, but I'm simply giving you a quick tour of South America so that we can all clearly understand where Venezuela is located. Remember, we're talking about geopolitics. I said geopolitics is about who controls important things, where are those important things, and why are those things important. Now, South America, just like North America, where the United States is physically located, has long been treated by the US as its own area of influence. Put simply, the United States believes that what happens in South America is its business. This American attitude goes back to 1823 when the US introduced the Monroe Doctrine, named after James Monroe, who was the president at the time. His message was clear. European powers should stay out of South America, and if they don't, the United States would step in. Since then, every American president has operated with the same mindset. In particular, Donald Trump has repeatedly referred to the Monroe Doctrine and applied it in his own blunt, different, unique way, often called the Monroe Doctrine. Simply put, the United States will not accept rival powers gaining influence in North and South America. That is why, when the US acts in South America, it does not see itself as interfering in someone else's region. It sees itself as defending its territory and its interests. Now, Venezuela is an oil-rich country. It has the world's largest oil reserves. US influence in Venezuela began when oil was discovered in that country. American companies became major players in the oil industry. And from that point on, US economic and political interests were closely linked to Venezuela. Even after President Carlos Perez nationalized the oil industry in the 1970s, US-Venezuela relations remained cordial. In fact, special arrangements were made to allow American companies to continue operating in Venezuela with few restrictions. But everything changed when a man named Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998. This man started challenging the dominance of America and began promoting a strong message of national sovereignty. But maybe let me briefly touch on how Hugo Chavez became president. Because you see, the man we are discussing today, Nicolas Maduro, played a key role in Hugo Chavez's rise to power. By the way, Nicolas Maduro himself rose from humble beginnings as a bus driver, later becoming a trade union leader. But his political career began in the 1990s when he joined the MBR movement formed by Hugo Chavez. In 1992, Chavez, who was a mid-level commander in the army at the time, led a failed coup and was imprisoned. Maduro was part of an organized team that campaigned for his release. He also actively supported the successful presidential bid of Hugo Chavez in 1998. By 2005, Maduro had risen to become President of the National Assembly, a role similar to a Speaker of Parliament. He soon became a leading member in Hugo Chavez's government at a time when US-Venezuela relations were deteriorating. And as I already mentioned, Hugo Chavez positioned Venezuela firmly against US influence and rejected external control over his country's resources. He introduced very strict oil rules for foreign companies, and any company that refused these terms had its assets taken over by the state. This forms part of what Donald Trump means when he says America lost money in Venezuela. In 2002, the United States backed a failed coup against Hugo Chavez. This worsened relations and emboldened Chavez in his anti-imperialist fight. In this sense, he closely resembled Robert Mugabe in his emphasis on national sovereignty and territorial integrity. When Mugabe was saying, "Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe," Hugo Chavez was calling the American president at the time, George Bush, the devil. He famously described the US as the biggest menace to our planet. In 2006, Hugo Chavez appointed Nicolas Maduro as the foreign minister. This placed Maduro at the center of the diplomatic conflict between Venezuela and the US. At one point, he was briefly detained at a New York airport after refusing to be searched. US officials later apologized, saying the airport staff were unaware at the time that he was the Venezuela Minister of Foreign Affairs. But Maduro would have none of it, calling the American government racist and Nazi. While all of this was unfolding, the president, Hugo Chavez, was fighting a different battle. He was seriously ill with cancer. In 2013, he died. But months before his death, Chavez had already made his choice clear. He publicly named Nicolas Maduro as his successor. So Maduro took over immediately as interim president. A month later, a presidential election was held, and Maduro won by a very narrow margin. The opposition rejected the result, but Maduro was officially declared the winner. He quickly moved to assert his authority, removing political rivals and replacing them with his trusted lieutenants. 2 years after the death of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela held parliamentary elections. The opposition coalition won a majority in the National Assembly, setting the stage for the crisis that followed. You see, the victory of the opposition coalition meant that even if Maduro won the next presidential election scheduled for 2018, he would be forced to govern with a parliament dominated by the opposition. When the 2018 presidential election was held, Maduro was declared the winner, but just like in 2013, the opposition rejected the outcome. However, this time around, things were different. The opposition controlled parliament. It used that control to declare the presidency vacant. Under Venezuela's constitution, the Speaker of Parliament takes over in such cases. The Speaker at the time was opposition leader Juan Guaido, who declared himself a president. The United States quickly recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's leader and gave his team diplomatic recognition and control over some state assets held overseas. However, Guaido failed to take power because he never gained control of the military, courts, and other state institutions. And as a result, Guaido had Western support but no real power inside Venezuela. Maduro remained in charge and neutralized parliament. He used the judiciary to remove MPs. Protests were violently suppressed, with over 100 protesters killed. Over 5,000 people were arrested, including opposition leaders. Some were forced into exile. People who criticized government were labeled agents of regime change agenda. And speaking of regime change, about 3 months after the 2018 elections, Maduro survived an assassination attempt. This gave him some form of invincibility. There was even a cartoon series modeled after him, called a Super Mustache, used as a propaganda tool by the national broadcaster. But the US-Venezuela crisis deepened when the United States expanded existing financial sanctions and imposed major oil sanctions. These measures severely damaged the Venezuelan economy. Poverty increased, inequality widened, inflation skyrocketed, and soon there were food shortages, which led to looting. An estimated 7 million people left the country. Yet, Maduro remained in power. This once again raised serious questions about the effectiveness of sanctions. The United States tightened sanctions in an effort to pressure Maduro to step down. Instead, the sanctions mainly hurt ordinary citizens. They failed to remove Maduro from power. He remained in office. This pattern is not unique to Venezuela, by the way. Other examples include Zimbabwe and Cuba. In each of those cases, the leaders who were targeted by the sanctions lived luxurious lives while innocent citizens languished in poverty. In 2019, the United States backed a failed coup against Nicolas Maduro. This coup attempt was led by that opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who had declared himself a president. However, the coup failed because he did not get enough military backing. Only a handful of soldiers supported him. America's chosen man had failed. And again, Nicolas Maduro remained in charge. Politically speaking, this man had 9 lives. In March 2020, the US Department of Justice opened court cases against Nicolas Maduro and 14 other officials. They were accused of drug trafficking and working with drug gangs, which the US authorities described as narco-terrorism. So legally speaking, Maduro was indicted. He became a wanted man in the United States of America. Those are some of the charges he is facing today. But in 2022, 2 years after the indictment of Maduro, which made him a wanted man, America made a U-turn. You see, the war in Ukraine disrupted the global balance of power. The United States had imposed sanctions on Russia as punishment for invading Ukraine. Russia responded by putting restrictions on its oil, which affected America and their allies. This threatened to push oil prices up, a situation that would have been politically damaging for Joe Biden as he approached the 2024 election. All of a sudden, Venezuela's oil became strategically important. So Joe Biden sent a delegation to Venezuela to negotiate a deal with Nicolas Maduro. They reached an agreement. US sanctions would be eased if Nicolas Maduro supplied oil and allowed free elections. Maduro agreed and promised to let the opposition participate in the 2024 elections. However, as the elections approached, the same pattern returned. Opposition figures were arrested, reports of beatings emerged, and the media faced heavy restrictions. The election was again disputed. And this time around, the Electoral Commission did not even publish a detailed breakdown of the results. It simply announced that Nicolas Maduro had won by 52%. Once again, Maduro remained in charge. But there are 2 things to note here. First of all, America reached a deal with a man it had already indicted, a man who was on America's wanted list of criminals. Remember, in March 2020, the US Department of Justice charged Nicolas Maduro with narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. Venezuela had been put under very tight sanctions because of the activities of this man. But in 2022, when they needed oil, he was no longer a criminal. This proves that American foreign policy does not care about democracy, human rights, or even the criminal history of any president, for as long as that president does not threaten US interests. When it comes to foreign policy, the United States does not act to promote democracy. It acts to protect and advance its national interests. This approach is consistent across the globe. The United States maintains close alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. All these countries are ruled by strong leaders. There is no democracy in these countries, yet they are allies of America, the leader of the free world. Their lack of democracy has never prevented cooperation because those governments are not a threat to US strategic interests. This reveals the core principle of American foreign policy. That is why, even in Zimbabwe, the Gukuraundi killings did not put Robert Mugabe's government in trouble. An estimated 20,000 people were killed. Yet, there was no US intervention, no serious condemnation, and no sanctions. Why? Because at that time, Robert Mugabe did not threaten American interests. He was a friend of the West. He was even knighted by the British. But that changed in 2001 after Zimbabwe carried out a land reform program. That policy directly affected Western and American economic interests. Once those interests were compromised, sanctions followed. It is never about democracy. It is never about human rights. And it's definitely not about those drug-related charges against Nicolas Maduro. They are just a tool. They serve as a justification to advance America's regional dominance and strategic control. From this history, you can clearly see a pattern. America has, for many years, tried to exert its influence over Venezuela. It demonstrated this by backing a failed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002. When the coup flopped, America hoped that the removal or death of Hugo Chavez would open the door to a different kind of leader, but that also did not happen. The United States then took advantage of the 2018 presidential election crisis by backing Juan Guaido. Yet that effort also failed as well. So when you look at it, America literally tried everything, eventually using force to capture him. The real question now is not what happens to Maduro. It's what happens to Venezuela. Who will control its vast oil resources? Who will speak for its people? And how much of its sovereignty will remain intact during this transition? The answers to those questions will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point for Venezuelans or just another chapter written by forces beyond their control. But whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.